In March of 1958, Elizabeth Taylor, arguably the most beautiful woman in the world, stood on the courthouse steps clutching her third divorce decree. A reporter shouted a question through the frenzy of flashing bulbs. "Miss Taylor, do you still believe in love?" Her answer would become legendary. "I am a very committed wife," she said. "And I should be committed too, for being married so many times." Later in life, she would reflect more somberly. "I've been in love with 7 men and married 8 times. God gave me beauty, fame, success, and wealth, but he never gave me happiness." How can a woman who seemingly had it all fail so spectacularly and so repeatedly at the one thing she craved most? Today, we're not just telling a story, we are going to decode it. Welcome to Fanko Decodes. I'm Fanko, and together we're going to break down the patterns and unlock the brutal truths hidden within the legendary life of Elizabeth Taylor. She was more than a star. She was a supernova of the Hollywood Golden Age, a 2-time Academy Award winner for Best Actress, the first actor in history, male or female, to command $1 million salary for a single film. For Cleopatra, she was paid a staggering $7 million. To put that in perspective, adjusted for today's inflation, that's the equivalent of over $60 million for one movie. She was a titan, a tycoon in diamonds and chiffon. Yet this powerhouse of a woman stumbled in love 8 times. Her roster of husbands reads like a casting call for a dramatic epic: a hotel heir, a gentlemanly British actor, a larger-than-life Hollywood producer, a pop crooner, a legendary Welsh thespian, a U.S. senator, and a construction worker. What's truly staggering is that each failure, each public heartbreak, represents a classic archetypal mistake in choosing a partner. These are traps that many of us, especially high-achieving women today, can still fall into. Taylor's story is a masterclass in what not to do. Are you ready to decode a raw, unflinching story about love, money, and the beautiful, messy truth of human nature? Let's begin with marriage number 1, the 7-month fairy tale that became a nightmare. Code number 1, the illusion of the perfect blueprint. May 6, 1950. A picture-perfect day at the Church of the Good Shepherd in Beverly Hills. An 18-year-old Elizabeth Taylor, draped in an ivory satin gown that cost more than a suburban home, glided down the aisle on the arm of Conrad Nicky Hilton Jr., age 23. On paper, it was a match forged in Hollywood heaven. The groom, the handsome 6 feet 1 inch heir to the Hilton Hotel fortune, a former naval officer with a playboy smile. The bride, Hollywood's fastest rising star, fresh off a string of hits and already under a lucrative contract with MGM, earning $2,000 a week. That's over $25,000 a week in today's money, at 18. The media dubbed them Hollywood's golden couple. MGM, the powerful studio that essentially owned Taylor, orchestrated the wedding as a massive PR event. It was the social event of the year. But this fairy tale imploded in just 245 days. Taylor later wrote about the details with chilling clarity in her autobiography. She had dreamed of a fairy tale wedding since she was a little girl, a fantasy heavily promoted by her studio. But as she stood at the altar, a wave of profound unease washed over her. "When the minister asked if I would take this man, I paused for a few seconds," she recalled. "It wasn't nervousness. It was the sudden, terrifying realization that I knew absolutely nothing about the man who was about to become my husband." That premonition proved devastatingly accurate. The honeymoon was a 14-week cruise to Europe, which sounds romantic. It was, in fact, a floating prison. Nicky spent the majority of his time and his money at the ship's casino and bars, gambling and drinking heavily. Taylor recalled their honeymoon as a blur of smoky casinos, loud nightclubs, and lonely nights waiting in their cabin. Even more shocking was his attitude toward her career. The Hilton family was dazzled by Taylor's fame and earning power, yet they held a deeply conservative view of a wife's role. They expected her to be a demure, domestic socialite. He would boast to his friends, "Look at my tailor, she earns $2,000 a week, as if I were a prize racehorse," she wrote. But the moment I had to go back to the studio for work, he'd sneer, "You're a Hilton now, a lady of the house. Why do you need to be seen in public all the time?" The most brutal blow came 3 months into the marriage. Taylor became pregnant. But amidst the constant alcohol-fueled arguments and her husband's chilling indifference, she suffered a miscarriage. According to her friends, on the day she lost the baby, Nicky Hilton was not by her side at the hospital. He was at a casino. When he finally showed up and Taylor, heartbroken, needed his comfort, his words were, "Well, it's probably for the best. We're young. No need to rush into having kids." In that moment, the last vestiges of the fairy tale shattered. In January 1951, they were officially divorced. In court, Taylor's testimony was heartbreaking. "I thought I was marrying for love. I discovered I was just another one of his business transactions." This first disastrous marriage taught Taylor her first hard lesson. A perfect match on paper guarantees nothing. Wealth plus wealth, beauty plus beauty. It looks perfect from the outside, but it crumbles without the fundamental pillars of mutual respect, shared values, and genuine understanding. She had no idea this was just the first pitfall on a long, treacherous road of love. Many more traps awaited. Code number 2, the gentle cage of overcorrection. February 21st, 1952. Another wedding. This time, a 20-year-old Taylor made a choice that was a complete overcorrection from her first trauma. She chose the polar opposite of the brash, abusive Nicky Hilton. She chose Michael Wilding. Wilding was a respected British actor, 20 years her senior. He was the quintessential English gentleman, soft-spoken, impeccably mannered, and utterly devoted to her. He was calm where Nicky was volatile, gentle where Nicky was cruel. "After the brutality of my first marriage, I thought what I needed was gentleness," Taylor later reflected. "Michael offered me a sense of security I had never known." This marriage lasted 5 years, her second longest. She had 2 sons with Wilding, Michael Jr. and Christopher. On the surface, it was the picture of domestic bliss, a doting husband, 2 beautiful children, and a wife whose career was exploding into the stratosphere. But the cracks began to show, quietly at first, then all at once. As Taylor's star ascended, the gap between them widened into a chasm. In 1956, she starred in Giant, a colossal hit that earned 10 Oscar nominations, including one for her. Wilding's career, meanwhile, was gently fading. He was becoming known simply as Mr. Elizabeth Taylor. More importantly, Wilding's gentleness began to feel suffocating. It was a passive devotion that bordered on subservience. Friends from that era recalled that Wilding was almost pathologically agreeable. He never said no to her. Whatever Elizabeth wanted, Michael provided. When she threw one of her famous tantrums, he wouldn't argue back. He would simply absorb her fury in silence. "At first, I found it sweet," Taylor confessed. "But slowly, I began to feel he lacked a spine. I didn't need a yes man. I needed a partner who could stand up to me, who could challenge me, an equal." By 1956, the gossip columns were buzzing with rumors of Taylor's affairs with other actors. Most of them were true. She later admitted she was desperately seeking an emotional and passionate connection elsewhere. "I loved Michael," she said, "but I no longer respected him. A man who constantly submits makes you feel like a tyrant." What pained Taylor the most was that even her betrayals were met with Wilding's quiet acceptance. He never confronted her, never fought for her. He just silently endured the public humiliation and the pitying glances from their friends. Her close friend, Debbie Reynolds, summed it up perfectly at the time. "Michael is a lovely, sensitive, gentle man, but he couldn't give Elizabeth the fire she needed." In 1957, they parted amicably. In a post-divorce interview, Wilding said, with characteristic grace, "I love Elizabeth. I understand her. She is a creature of passion, and perhaps I was just too quiet for her world." This divorce taught Taylor her second painful lesson: excessive gentleness and total submission are not love. A healthy relationship requires a balance of power. It needs mutual respect, which can only exist between two strong, independent individuals. It needs friction, debate, and the collision of two equal souls. But she had yet to learn that the fire she craved could also burn her to the ground. The next man she met would bring her the greatest joy of her life and its greatest sorrow. Code number 3, the collision with an equal force and the price of true love. February 2nd, 1957. Acapulco, Mexico. The private plane of legendary producer Mike Todd touched down on the tarmac. He rushed down the steps and headed straight for the hotel where Elizabeth Taylor was staying. They had met just a few months earlier at a Hollywood party. Todd was the man of the hour, his film Around the World in 80 Days having just won the Oscar for Best Picture. Physically, Todd was the opposite of Taylor's usual type. He was short, stocky, and rugged, with a face like a bulldog, perpetually chomping on a cigar and speaking in a torrent of profanity. And yet, this man, who looked more like a mob boss than a movie mogul, was the one who would finally ignite Taylor's soul. Todd was 24 years her senior, a self-made man who had lived a dozen lifetimes. He radiated a raw, magnetic power. He bowed to no one, least of all Elizabeth Taylor. On their first day, Todd showed up 2 hours late. When an indignant Taylor confronted him, he shot back without apology. "Listen, beautiful, if you can't wait, you can leave. My time is just as valuable as yours." This attitude, this complete refusal to worship her, was exactly what captivated her. "Every man I'd ever known either treated me like a goddess to be worshipped or an investment to be managed," Taylor later recalled. "Mike was the first man who treated me like a woman." In February 1957, they married in a secret ceremony in Mexico. Their marriage lasted only 13 months, but Taylor would forever describe it as the happiest period of her entire life. Todd was a man of extravagant extremes. He was wildly generous, but also fiercely controlling. He gifted her a 29-carat diamond ring that cost $300,000, the equivalent of over $3 million today. When Taylor wore it to the Academy Awards, the world gasped. He threw her lavish parties and showered her with priceless art. But Todd also demanded her complete devotion. He insisted she turn down non-essential film roles to focus on being his wife. Not because he was jealous of her career, he was immensely proud of it, but because he wanted their relationship to be the center of their universe. "Mike was the first man who ever truly conquered me," Taylor said. "He never indulged my whims. Every time I lost my temper, he'd come back at me with an even bigger one. And strangely, that made me feel safer than I'd ever felt in my life." Friends recalled that their fights were epic. They would scream at each other in public, their voices echoing through restaurants and hotel lobbies. But minutes later, they would be clinging to each other, kissing passionately. "They were the most can't live with them, can't live without them couple I've ever seen," one friend said. But you could feel this incredible, visceral passion between them. They were utterly obsessed with each other. Then, on March 22, 1958, tragedy struck. Mike Todd's private plane, ironically named the Lucky Liz, was flying from Los Angeles to New York. It went down in a storm over New Mexico, killing everyone on board. Taylor was in the middle of filming Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. When she received the news, her world didn't just crumble, it ceased to exist. She let out a scream so primal that it was said to have haunted the cast and crew for years. She was sedated and hospitalized, refusing to eat or speak for days. At the funeral, she was a specter of grief, nearly collapsing as she clung to the coffin. "I've lost my life," she told reporters, her voice a raw whisper. "Mike wasn't just my husband. He was my everything." In the aftermath, Taylor discovered another painful truth. The lavish showman was massively in debt. Most of the expensive gifts were bought on credit. But she didn't care. She sold off some of her own jewels, including the diamond ring, to help pay off his debts. She learned her third, most profound lesson from this brief, blazing marriage. True love is a mutual conquest. It is a duel of strong wills and a fusion of souls. It is not about finding someone to complete you, but about finding another whole person who matches your intensity. But fate had played a cruel joke. The moment she found it, it was snatched away. And what happened next would become one of the biggest scandals in Hollywood history. Code number 4, the grief placeholder and the betrayal of a friendship. May 12, 1959, Las Vegas. Less than 14 months after Mike Todd's death, Elizabeth Taylor was at the altar again. The groom this time was Eddie Fisher, a 29-year-old pop singer. But this wedding was not a celebration. It was a scandal, because the groom was, or had been, the husband of her best friend. Fisher's wife was Debbie Reynolds, the bubbly girl-next-door star known as America's sweetheart. She and Taylor were incredibly close. After Todd's death, it was Debbie who rushed to Taylor's side, comforting her day and night. She even sent her own husband, Eddie, over to help manage things and keep Elizabeth company. As it turned out, he got a little too comforting. The story, pieced together from eyewitness accounts, is pure Hollywood drama. 3 weeks after Todd's death, Fisher got a call from a distraught Taylor. "Eddie," she cried, "I need to talk about Mike. You were his best friend. You're the only one who can understand my pain." Fisher had indeed been Todd's protege, and he felt a deep loyalty to his late friend. So he began visiting Taylor frequently, sharing memories and offering a shoulder to cry on. At first, Debbie was completely unsuspecting. She was glad her husband could be there for her grieving friend. "I thought he was doing a good deed," she later said, with heartbreaking naivete. But things spiraled out of control. According to Fisher's friends, Taylor became intensely dependent on him. She would call him in the middle of the night, weeping, saying she was terrified of being alone and begging him to come over. Elizabeth was incredibly vulnerable, a friend recalled. She needed someone, anyone, to fill the enormous void Mike had left. And Eddie was right there. The turning point came 6 weeks after Todd's death. Fisher got another frantic call from Taylor. When he arrived at her home, he found her semi-conscious, having taken an overdose of sleeping pills. He rushed her to the hospital. As she lay in the hospital bed, she gripped his hand and whispered, "Eddie, if you leave me too, I'll truly have nothing left." In that moment, Fisher was lost. The affair escalated quickly. By August 1958, the gossip columns had the story. Debbie Reynolds found out her marriage was over by reading it in the newspaper. When a reporter asked Debbie for a comment, she delivered a line of pure class that only served to highlight Taylor's selfishness. "I wish Eddie happiness." But Taylor was unrepentant. In a press conference, she brazenly declared, "You can't break up a happy marriage." Debbie and Eddie's marriage wasn't happy. This public defiance enraged America. Taylor was branded a homewrecker. She received thousands of letters of condemnation, cinemas boycotted her films, and her Oscar nomination for Cat on a Hot Tin Roof was seen as a long shot due to the scandal. In May 1959, Fisher divorced Debbie and married Elizabeth. But a marriage built on betrayal and desperation was doomed from the start. The fundamental problem was that Taylor was never in love with Eddie Fisher. She was in love with the memory of Mike Todd. She needed a placeholder to staunch the bleeding of her grief, and Fisher was a convenient, willing substitute. He was, in her eyes, Mike's ghost. Friends recalled that throughout their marriage, Taylor continued to wear Mike Todd's wedding ring. When Fisher protested, she would coolly reply, "This is between me and Mike. It has nothing to do with you." Even more cruelly, she often humiliated him in public. On one film set, she reportedly screamed at him in front of the entire crew, "I thought I was marrying a living version of Mike Todd. I didn't realize I was just marrying his ghost. Fisher, overwhelmed and outmatched, began drinking heavily. Their relationship soured into a toxic mix of resentment and regret. Then in 1962, on the set of Cleopatra in Rome, Taylor laid eyes on her next conquest, Richard Burton. Once again, she was ready to discard a husband in pursuit of a new, all-consuming passion. Fisher learned a brutal lesson: never be anyone's substitute. And Taylor learned another: a relationship built on need and sympathy is a fragile house of cards. It can never replace one built on genuine love. But she was about to make a mistake so colossal, so legendary, that it would once again make her the most talked about woman on the planet. Codes number 5, number 6, The Twin Flame Inferno in a Decade of Love and War. September 15, 1962. Rome. On the gargantuan set of Cleopatra, a moment occurred that would forever alter Hollywood history. A 30-year-old Elizabeth Taylor met a 37-year-old Welsh actor named Richard Burton. He would become the undisputed love of her life. Their first meeting is legendary. Taylor was in her dressing room when Burton, hungover and slightly disheveled, walked in to run lines. He looked at her with her famous violet eyes, and his first words were, "My God, you're beautiful." Taylor, unfazed, looked him up and down and replied with a smirk, "You're not so bad yourself for a Welshman, though your nose is a bit crooked." They both burst out laughing. It was the start of one of the most passionate, tumultuous, and public love affairs of the 20th century. Burton was unlike any man she had ever known. Born into a poor Welsh mining family, he had clawed his way to Oxford on a scholarship and become one of the most respected Shakespearean actors of his generation. He possessed a deep intellect, a poet's soul, and the raw, brooding intensity of his Welsh roots. Crucially, Burton was her equal. He was a titan of the stage and screen in his own right, with his own pride, his own demons, and his own formidable talent. The chemistry between them on set was immediate and thermonuclear. The problem? They were both married. Taylor to Eddie Fisher, Burton to his Welsh wife, Sybil Williams. Crew members recalled that the affair, which they nicknamed La Scandale, ignited almost instantly. Within a month of shooting, they were openly seeing each other, disappearing into trailers and frequenting quiet Roman restaurants. In October 1962, the Italian paparazzi broke the story. The news exploded across the globe. The backlash was even bigger than the Fisher scandal because it involved the destruction of two families. The Vatican itself issued a statement condemning Taylor for erotic vagrancy. A U.S. congresswoman even tried to have her barred from re-entering the country on moral grounds. But Taylor and Burton were beyond caring. They were trapped in the gravitational pull of their obsession. Burton later described their connection. "Elizabeth and I were like two planets hurtling towards each other. We couldn't resist the mutual attraction, even knowing the collision would likely result in our annihilation." On March 15, 1964, after both had secured messy divorces, they married in Montreal. This first marriage lasted 10 years. It was the most complex, passionate, and destructive period of her life. They were at once the most deeply in love couple and the most vicious combatants. When they were in love, they were inseparable. Burton famously bought Taylor the 69-carat Taylor Burton diamond for over $1 million. They made 11 films together, traveled the world on their yacht, and lived a life of unimaginable luxury and excess. Friends remember their devotion. Taylor would wait for Burton on set for hours. During his stage run of Hamlet, she watched the play from the wings over 40 times. But when they fought, they were capable of inflicting devastating emotional wounds. Their battles were legendary, often fueled by copious amounts of alcohol. The main sources of conflict were threefold. First, professional jealousy. While both were superstars, Taylor's box office power was greater. She commanded higher salaries, and in their joint films, she was often the one who received the awards, while Burton, to his immense frustration, was perennially nominated but rarely won. Second, lifestyle clashes. Burton was a voracious reader, an intellectual who loved poetry and deep conversation. Taylor loved glamorous parties, shopping, and socializing. He was a brooding Welshman. She was a Hollywood queen. Third, clashing personalities. Both were alpha personalities, stubborn and unwilling to back down. Friends recalled them renting out entire hotel floors just so their screaming matches wouldn't disturb other guests. In 1973, after 9 years of this beautiful, brutal dance, they divorced for the first time. But they couldn't stay away. Just 16 months later, on October 10, 1975, they remarried in a remote village in Botswana. The second marriage lasted only 10 months. The final straw was Burton's escalating alcoholism. By his own admission, he was drinking up to 3 bottles of vodka a day. The drinking made him paranoid, abusive, and erratic. The love was still there, but the relationship had become pure poison. On July 29, 1976, they divorced for the second and final time. At the time, Taylor told a reporter, "Richard and I proved one thing. Passion is not the same as love. We had the most intense passion in the world, but we lacked the ability for quiet, everyday living." Burton's words were equally heartbreaking. "I love Elizabeth, and I will probably love her until the day I die. But loving someone and living with them are two very different things." This epic, 10-year saga taught Taylor her fourth and most painful lesson. Even the truest love can become a form of mutual torture if two people cannot find a sustainable way to be together. Passion is the spark, but it's not the whole fire. A lasting relationship requires more than just intensity. It requires the wisdom of compromise, understanding, and compatibility. But at 44, Taylor hadn't quite learned that wisdom yet. She was entering the second half of her life where even more brutal lessons awaited. Code number 7, the political transaction and the deception of reinvention. December 4th, 1976. A farm in Virginia. A 44-year-old Elizabeth Taylor walked down the aisle for the 7th time. The groom was John Warner, a 49-year-old lawyer and gentleman farmer. On the surface, this seemed like a mature, perfect choice. Warner was distinguished, educated, and completely removed from the glitz and phoniness of Hollywood. He seemed to offer the stability and peace that Taylor, battered by the storms with Burton, desperately needed. What she didn't know was that she was walking into a meticulously planned political strategy, and she was its star asset. Warner was no simple farmer. He had a burning ambition to become a U.S. Senator from Virginia, and marrying the most famous woman in the world was his golden ticket. Warner's calculation was cold and precise. Taylor's fame would bring him media attention. Her wealth could fund his campaign. Her social connections could open doors. The wedding itself was a political rally disguised as a marriage ceremony, packed with politicians and press. Life after the wedding quickly revealed Warner's true colors. Taylor later recalled that from the day after their wedding, Warner began a campaign to mold her into the perfect politician's wife. "He told me that as a senator's wife, I had to be more dignified," Taylor said. "He hated it when I wore purple, my signature color, because it was too dramatic. He disliked my Hollywood friends because they were too loud. He even criticized the way I spoke, calling it too direct." Worse, Warner demanded that Taylor put her career on hold to play the role of his supportive spouse. And for a time, she did. She made enormous sacrifices for his political career. She sold off precious jewelry, including pieces from Mike Todd, to help fund his campaign. She dutifully attended countless fundraisers and rallies, shaking hands and smiling for photos with voters. Campaign aides recalled how uncomfortable she often seemed. One voter bluntly asked her, "Mrs. Warner, why are you so much fatter in person than you are in the movies?" The questions were cruel, but for the sake of her husband's ambition, she endured the humiliation. In 1978, with Taylor's star power as his secret weapon, John Warner won the election and became Senator Warner. And the moment he won, he no longer needed her. Once he got what he wanted, he was done with me, Taylor said with bitterness years later. He was consumed by Washington. He was never home. And when he was, he'd ignore me completely, as if I were a piece of furniture. The ultimate insult came at a political dinner. When someone brought up Taylor's colorful past and many husbands, Warner publicly stated, "I would appreciate it if people would forget my wife's past and focus on her present role." That one sentence lit a fire in her. He was saying my past, the life that made me who I am, was something to be ashamed of, Taylor fumed. But if he couldn't accept all of me, why did he marry me in the first place? In 1980, Taylor began her rebellion. She went on a diet, losing 60 pounds. She reconnected with her old Hollywood contacts and triumphantly returned to acting, first on Broadway and then in television. Warner was furious. He claimed her return to the vulgarity of show business would damage his political career. Taylor's response was simple: "Then let's get a divorce." They officially divorced on November 7, 1982. This marriage taught Taylor her fifth crucial lesson: never, ever sacrifice your authentic self for a relationship. The moment someone asks you to change your fundamental nature to fit their needs, it is no longer love. It is a transaction. It is control. At 50 years old, Taylor was finally beginning to understand that she didn't need a man to reshape her, but one who could appreciate the masterpiece, flaws and all, that she already was. But her final marriage would prove that the opposite extreme was just as dangerous. Code number 8, the Savior Complex and the Final, Tragic Error. October 6, 1991. Michael Jackson's Neverland Ranch. A 59-year-old Elizabeth Taylor, dressed in a canary yellow wedding gown, married for the 8th and final time. The groom was a 39-year-old construction worker named Larry Fortensky. The wedding was a spectacle, officiated by Michael Jackson with a guest list that included Hollywood royalty. In reality, it was perhaps the saddest and most misguided decision of her life. Who was Larry Fortensky? He was a former truck driver with a history of drinking problems and a high school education. They had met in 1988 at the Betty Ford Center, the famous rehab clinic. Taylor was there to battle her addiction to painkillers and alcohol. Fortensky was there for his own alcoholism. According to friends, Taylor was drawn to what she perceived as his simplicity and authenticity. After a lifetime of complex, high-powered men, she believed she needed someone simple, direct, and unassuming. "Larry isn't complicated like my other husbands," she told friends at the time. "He has no agenda. He won't use me. He just loves me for me." But Taylor was ignoring a glaring, fatal reality: the vast, unbridgeable chasm in their ages, life experiences, education levels, and social standing. Married life quickly exposed the fantasy. First, there was the money. Fortensky was unemployed and lived entirely off Taylor's immense wealth. While she was generous, the power imbalance created enormous psychological pressure on him. "Everyone called me Mr. Elizabeth Taylor. They said I was a gold digger," Fortensky later said in an interview. "It made me angry, but what could I say? It was the truth." Second, the social divide. Taylor's world was one of A-list celebrities, artists, and intellectuals. Fortensky, a blue-collar guy, was completely out of his depth. Friends recalled a dinner party where Fortensky, feeling ignored and inadequate, stormed out, leaving Taylor to manage the awkward aftermath. The most critical issue was communication. They had no common language, no shared frame of reference. Their arguments were frequent and petty. He couldn't grasp the pressures of her world, and she couldn't understand the deep-seated insecurity and resentment that festered within him. On October 31, 1996, 5 years after the lavish wedding, they divorced. In a moment of sad clarity, Taylor said, "I thought love was enough to conquer differences in age and background. I was wrong. Love needs equality. It needs mutual understanding. It needs a shared language. This final, failed marriage delivered her sixth and last lesson. True love cannot be built on a foundation of pity or a desire to save someone. When you enter a relationship as a savior, you don't earn love. You breed resentment. On March 23, 2011, Dame Elizabeth Taylor died in Los Angeles at the age of 79. She never married again. In the last 2 decades of her life, she channeled her immense passion and energy into a new cause, AIDS activism. After the death of her friend Rock Hudson, she co-founded AMFAR, the American Foundation for AIDS Research, and became one of the world's most powerful and effective advocates in the fight against the disease. "I finally found something truly worth dedicating myself to," she said. Perhaps this was her most important marriage, a union with her own purpose. Conclusion: the codes we live by. So, after walking through this epic, often tragic saga of 8 marriages, what is our decoding of Elizabeth Taylor's life revealed? Her love life is a textbook, a definitive guide to the common traps we fall into when choosing a partner. Each mistake is a profound lesson, a code for a wiser life. Code number 1, the illusion of the perfect blueprint. Compatibility on paper means nothing without a connection of values. Code number 2, the danger of overcorrection. Love isn't about one person erasing themselves for the other. It's about 2 whole people standing together as equals. Code number 3, the emptiness of the rebound. A relationship founded on need, not genuine love, is destined to fail. True healing takes time. Code number 4, the confusion of passion and compatibility. Intense passion does not equal long-term compatibility. A lasting relationship must be able to survive the quiet, everyday moments. Code number 5, the betrayal of self. Never abandon your core identity to please a partner. The moment someone demands you change who you are, it ceases to be love. Code number 6, the trap of the savior complex. Healthy relationships are a partnership of equals, not a rescue mission. For successful, high-achieving women in particular, Taylor's story offers a powerful message: do not dim your own light for fear of intimidating someone. Seek a partner who celebrates your strength, who is inspired by your ambition, not threatened by it. In the last chapter of her life, Elizabeth Taylor found true fulfillment. It didn't come from a man. It came from her own value, her own mission. She once said something that holds the ultimate wisdom of her entire tumultuous life. "I always admitted that I was ruled by my passions." But perhaps her most profound realization was one she embodied in her later years, that she was already whole on her own. And that might be the most valuable lesson she leaves for us. Before you seek the right partner, become the right partner for yourself. Become a whole person first, because only a whole person can build a truly healthy, lasting love. So, what have you learned from this decode of Elizabeth Taylor's life? What do you think is the biggest mistake people make today when it comes to love? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'm Fanko. If this story gave you a new code for thinking about love and life, please hit that like button, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Your engagement is what makes Fanko Decodes possible. We'll see you next time for another decode.